Good evening. We're going to get started. I expect some people will continue to straggle in, but we want to make maximum use of our time, so we're going to get started. My name is Ray Hilliard, and I'm the coordinator of the core course. I'm glad to see so many people here this evening. It's hard to say whether Sigmund Freud, since he first invented psychoanalysis in the late 19th century, has been more controversial or more influential. During the last quarter of a century or more, there's been a consistent attack on Freud and his ideas, while at the same time, psychoanalytic theory has continued to influence our thoughts about human behavior, even though we don't always realize that we're thinking in Freudian terms. Have you ever described a person as anal or anal compulsive, as being in denial, as being emotionally repressed, or as having a love-hate relationship with something or someone? If so, then you've absorbed ways of thinking about human behavior that come to us from Freud. We hope that our session this evening will help you better understand Freud's role in the development of modern culture, and it has been a very significant role, and the reasons why he remains controversial. Our moderator is the chair of the UR Department of Psychology, Dr. Jane Berry, and she'll briefly tell you more about what to expect and introduce our featured speakers. Jane?
Thank you, Dr. Hilliard, and thanks to Dr. Tom Bonfiglio from Modern Literatures and Cultures for suggesting the idea for this forum. The three of us and my colleague Scott Allison from Psychology have taught Freud's Civilization and its Discontents in the core course. All of our first-year students, many of whom are here tonight, are reading or are about to read this text. Our speakers tonight will address Freud's legacy in the 21st century. We will open with an argument for the staying power of some of Freud's most influential ideas from Dr. Timothy Hulsey, an associate professor of clinical psychology and dean of the Honors College at Virginia Commonwealth University. Our own Scott Allison, professor of social psychology at the University of Richmond, will offer a rejoinder. I'd say a rebuttal, but that's way too fraught with Freudian meaning. Dr. Halsey will speak for no more than 30 minutes, followed by a 15-minute reply from Dr. Allison, and then we will open it up to the floor for questions from you, especially students, so faculty try to put a lid on it. It's actually an auspicious year to hold such an event. It's the 100th anniversary of Freud's only visit to America, where he lectured at the invitation of G. Stanley Hall at Clark University in August of 1909. William James from Harvard showed up to see what Freud was like. Literally, to see what Freud was like were his words. We're glad you showed up tonight to see what Freud is like and was like. And now, Dr. Timothy Hulsey.
Good evening. Thanks for turning up on such a lovely evening to hear us talk about long-dead men and their ideas. I'm going to pass these pictures around and just have a look and pass them along, and hopefully by the time I get to the point where I want to discuss them, you will have all seen them. It's an interesting fact that over the past probably 40 years, there's been a dramatic decrease in the teaching of Freud and Freudian ideas in American psychology departments. Instead, in the United States, where Freudian ideas are taught at all, they tend to be taught in departments of literature or philosophy. When psychoanalytic ideas are taught in psychology classes, they're almost always oversimplified and or misrepresented. How many of you have had an intro psych class? A couple of you. So you'll know what I'm talking about. Most introductory psychology texts present a sensationalized version of psychoanalytic theory that focuses on infantile sexuality and the psychosexual stages. And they're presented as though this were the pinnacle of Freudian thinking and that his ideas on the subjects were clear. When, of course, when you studied Freud for as long as I have, you realize that neither of those things are true. Those ideas occurred toward about midway through his career or earlier, and were in fact never clear in his mind in the way that they're presented in texts. The other mistake that's often made in introductory texts, and it occurs in other personality texts, abnormal psych texts, is that they never teach you the intellectual context within which these ideas were developed. Nor do they teach you that most of the language that Freud used was metaphorical. The id is not a thing. The ego is not a thing. The anal stage is a metaphor for the period of life when, at that point in history and still in most Western cultures, children are potty trained, and the struggles and issues that are thought to occur with children at that time. The oral stage is a metaphorical description for the period of a child's life when he or she uses his or her mouth to explore the world. It's a highly metaphorical language, but it gets reified in textbooks and presented to you as though it's a thing, it's a clear idea, and it's easily ridiculed. When these books, and faculty often, talk about Freud, they present him as ridiculous, obsessed with sex, and probably addicted to cocaine. Neither of those things was true. He was a very bourgeois, middle-class Austrian Jew with very bourgeois, middle-class Austrian Jewish morals, and like almost all educated people of his class, tried cocaine in the 1890s and quit it. Most texts ignore his later writings and offer little or no discussion of any of the psychoanalytic ideas that have been developed since Freud's death. Anyone here could write a just one page, double space, 12-point font, paper, on object relations theory? Anyone? Ego psychology? Self-psychology? That's my point. So all of the ideas of modern psychoanalysis get left out of these discussions of psychoanalytic theory certainly in introductory texts, but even in advanced undergraduate psych texts. Instead, Freud gets presented as unscientific, his ideas unsupported, a historical footnote to be reviewed and then quickly passed on in favor of modern psychological ideas. Excuse me, in part these biases stem from the fact that most textbooks are written by experimental psychologists with no clinical experience who have never studied formally, typically, psychoanalytic ideas. These biases also stem from the fact that psychoanalysis, the theory of psychoanalysis, never really has had a home in American academic psychology. Psychoanalysis came into the U.S. through the psychiatric community, and particularly through psychiatrists who practice. While this is happening, Freud's at Clark in Worcester in 1909, American universities had departments of psychology that were beginning with, initially, the early behavioral models, Watson and all of that. And then later, in the 20s and 30s, moving into a more formal behaviorism, eventually arriving at Skinner. And then information processing theories in the 50s, and then cognitive psychology in the 60s and 70s, and then cognitive neuroscience in the 70s and 80s, and now cognitive neuroscience continuing, and evolutionary psychology taking place alongside of it. All that's happening in American academic departments of psychology. And so what you see is that you have this basis of study within the departments of psychology, and then you see psychoanalysis for much of the 20th century as the dominant theory practiced by particularly psychiatrists who are out in practice. So this antagonistic relationship is created almost from the outset. And so when, after World War II, clinical psychology emerges and Freudian ideas begin to trickle into departments of psychology, they're not met with a warm reception. So our question tonight then is, why, if most of the things that you get taught in your undergraduate psychology education, if those things are true, why then are we here in 2009, more than 150 years after Freud's death, talking about this guy? And why is it, as Ray pointed out earlier, that so many of our ideas about psychology and about each other have at their origins psychoanalytic roots? And often it so permeates our culture that we don't even realize that that's where those ideas came from. Why hasn't this guy been removed to the dustbin of history with all those other 19th century charlatans and cranks? That's the question. My undergraduate experience was probably not too different from yours. I was taught by experimental psychologists who required books written by experimental psychologists who poo-pooed Freud. And initially, I didn't think much of it. I mean, it seemed reasonable. They were all much more excited about modern theories and their own research, and it was infectious. And in fact, I didn't set out to be a psychology major. I thought maybe philosophy or, I don't know, something else. But I had some very talented and enthusiastic psychology professors who really pulled me in. And so I undertook an undergraduate degree in psychology and studied these ideas, and I don't know, round about my junior year, I started to have a question. At first to myself, and later out loud, to the dismay of my professors, if this guy's so ridiculous, why is he so famous? Most ridiculous people pass away into the mists of history, and you don't hear anything about them. But this guy that hadn't happened. In fact, his ideas had all kinds of cultural currency, and currency in fields outside of psychology that were quite relevant and quite lively. But in psychology, the field he's often credited with having founded, at least by some, his ideas were ridiculed. Well, I was curious why that was, and I became more curious. And then eventually through my graduate education, and through some intentional choices, began to learn that there were a number of things about this theory that make it interesting, not the least of which is it's very complex and nuanced. And it seemed to fit with my own experience of what it is to be human, especially when it comes to understanding oneself. I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but our friends are very easy to understand. But we, not so much. You can always tell your friends what to do, and your advice is usually good. But when it comes to solving your own problems, it's a mystery. And so this idea that knowing oneself would be an easy task never made sense to me. And the psychoanalyst, the psychoanalytic theorist, comes at it from a perspective of saying it's not easy. And in fact, much of it's hidden from you. I learned some other things. Freud's ideas about human nature, as I've mentioned, and culture, as you know from reading Civilization and Its Discontents, are complex and sophisticated and applicable to a wide range of ideas beyond individual psychology. My colleagues in philosophy and literature and history never want to talk to me about cognitive psychology or about behaviorism. Freud's theory has played a signal role in our understanding of literature and biography, art and music, history and politics, sociology and anthropology, and even linguistics, rhetoric, and philosophy, not to mention our understandings of mass culture and advertising. Freudian ideas permeate our understanding of each other, as Ray pointed out earlier, even when we don't recognize that they were Freud's. I also learned that critics often misunderstand Freudian theory or attack out-of-date versions of psychoanalytic theory. Psychoanalysis, hard to believe, is not mummified. I just had a friend who was turned down in his application to join the Psychoanalytic Training Institute in San Francisco. They still exist, and they still even turn people down. Freud's dual instinct theory, the love and aggression, that model, is the one that is about the only psychoanalytic motivational theory that undergraduates in psychology ever get taught, despite the fact that virtually all contemporary psychoanalytic psychologists hold that humans have a number of motives, many of them rooted in biology, like sex and aggression, but nearly all elaborated by culture and experience. Whereas Freud emphasized the pursuit of sensual and sexual pleasure, object relations theorists, self-psychologists, and relational theorists include needs for relationships and self-esteem. Most American academic psychologists have read little or no Freud. Shocking? I know, but ask them. Yet they still have opinions about them, often strongly held opinions. Often opinions held so strongly that it makes you wonder why they have such strong emotional response to someone about whom they've never bothered to read. In what other arena of academic life would this be allowed? Psychoanalytic theory, contrary to much, is supported by scientific evidence, contrary to much opinion. While it's true that Freud did not conduct his work in a lab or follow the dictates of the 19th century model of science that dominates American psychology even today. To dismiss his ideas outright is naive, and it ignores the way that science actually works. Philosophers of science distinguish between the context of scientific discovery, in which initial observations are made and hypotheses are framed, and the context of justification, in which hypotheses are tested by use of the scientific method. Freud, and I'm quoting here, did not conduct group studies and apply statistical methods to confirm or refute predictions. His methodology was not borrowed from the natural sciences in the way that it has been by experimental psychologists. Rather, he relied upon in-depth analyses of single cases. While this methodology raises legitimate concerns about the generalizability of his findings, if his analysis of single case studies revealed a pattern that reflects universal human tendencies, this is valuable. As an analogy, Darwin's finches on the Galapagos might have been equally unrepresentative as a population survey by epidemiological standards. But yet his observations gave rise to the major theory in biology today. And contrary to the claims of many, there is in fact a considerable body of empirical work to support many psychoanalytic contentions. If you have questions about any of this after, or really want to know where I'm getting this, please feel free to come up after the talk and I will give you references, more than you want. So who was this guy who's created all this controversy for 150 years and gets people so riled up? Freud was born in a town then called Freiburg in what was then Moravia. It's now Pribor in the Czech Republic on May 6th of 1856. Now you got to think about that. What's going on in 1856? What's the Western European world like in 1856? He died in 1939, September 23rd, 1929 in London, having removed there in his very late years after fighting cancer of the jaw for 15 years, fleeing the Nazis. And what was Vienna like in the late 19th century? Anyone? In many ways, it was one of the intellectual centers of Europe. There was a kind of liberalism that had evolved there that allowed, with some struggles, even a Jew like Freud to succeed in academic circles. He seemed to have struggled more, and Jews seemed to struggle more in that context, but they were able to succeed. Nonetheless, Freud always experienced himself as an outsider. Now here's this guy. He comes from this small town in a fairly remote part of the empire. He's always the first in his class. His teachers always recognize how smart he is. He gets into the best college. He goes to the best medical school. He trains as a neurologist. This isn't someone who came from nowhere. This is someone who came from humble roots and ends up at Harvard and Johns Hopkins. He works with very famous neurologists who become mentors to him and sponsor his academic career, which is a requirement at that point in Europe and still today in some areas of Europe. He reads Darwin, right? Origin of Species is published 1859, 3 years after his birth. He's heavily influenced by this, as was everyone else. He's also influenced by the fact that they'd just discovered the neuron about 20 years previous to that. And so the excitement of that, there's this explosion, as today, of biological explanations for psychological disorders. But Freud wasn't convinced by this logic. He was curious, a very curious guy. And so at about the age, if you've seen that picture, the age of him with the big black mustaches and the dark black hair, about that age, he decides to raise a little money, because he didn't have any, to go to Paris to study with this very, very famous French neurologist named Charcot. Charcot's at the end of his career, and he's so famous he can do anything he wants. And what he's doing is he's demonstrating how psychological disorders can be created without any physiological intervention. He's using hypnosis to create hysterical symptoms and remove hysterical symptoms in patients, most of whom were female. So Freud goes to study with him. Charcot recognizes his genius. They become well acquainted. Charcot finds Freud very intelligent, asks him to translate some of his works into German, and invites him to his lectures. They have long discussions, and Freud begins to pressure him with some difficult questions about the role of sexuality in the etiology of hysteria. Surely there's some sexual conflict here. And you'll pardon the mangled pronunciation I'm about to produce. Charcot says, toujours la chose génitale. It always comes to sex. And Freud, in his 20s, says to himself in his diary, if he knows this, why does he never say it? He's struggling to understand these things. He's seeking out the best minds. He's trying to understand why we do what we do. And he spends the rest of his life trying to understand why we do what we do. Over the course of the 45 or 50 years of his writing about psychology, his ideas change. You would expect them to. The book that you all, or most of you, read, Civilization and Its Discontents, was written near the end of his career and is in some ways a culmination of many of his ideas. I know that it's difficult to read in the beginning if you haven't had much background because you don't know what some of the terms mean. He assumes that you've read all of his other stuff. So he gets into all the stuff about ego and id and cathexis and catharsis, and you don't know. But if you'd followed his career, of course, he'd built up these ideas and explained them and explored them for years, many years. So I'm trying to humanize the guy for you, and I wanted to show you younger pictures of him because there's this iconic Freud, the gray-bearded, balding man with a cigar that all of us have in our minds. But he wasn't always that guy. He didn't come out looking like that. He was a young man struggling to understand things and to communicate his understandings to a wider audience. He's doing this from the perspective of being a Jew in a time and place in Europe where, even though it was easier, it was still difficult, and always experiencing himself as an outsider. He would anticipate the criticism that his books would receive before it ever occurred, and then seek out the criticism to say, see, I told you so, and ignore the positive reviews that would also emerge. He's working with patients, lots of patients actually, over the years. There's often a criticism, well, he only saw middle-class Europeans. Well, yes, living in Vienna in the late 19th and early 20th century, his supply of patients was fairly monolithic. But there's nothing he could really do about that. You can argue about whether or not theories based on that population are then generalizable. You can't fault him for who he saw. He saw who was there. Freud's theory, as I mentioned before, and the theory that it developed over time became increasingly complex and increasingly sophisticated and changed in response to events. For example, 2 of his sons fought in World War I. World War I was a cataclysm. In Europe, they call it the Great War. It didn't affect America in the same way, so we don't think about it in the same way. But it was horrifying. Millions and millions of people dying in trenches made muddy with the blood of the fallen. Mustard gas. In the beginning of World War I, they had airplanes but no aerial bombs. They would fly over the trenches with mail sacks full of steel darts and pour them out. Freud saw all of this, and was much closer to it being in Austria, and on the losing side. And it affected him deeply, and it affected his theories. A lot of these theories, if you don't understand them in the intellectual context that he developed over the course of his years, do seem ridiculous. The Oedipus Complex. We all know absolutely for sure that none of us ever wanted to have sex with our parents. Right? Right? But there's another way to think about this. As a metaphor, the Oedipus Complex signals for the first time in a child's life the awareness of a relationship from which he will always be excluded. And when you think about it that way, it doesn't seem so weird. There is a sexual component, and I'm not trying to deny that, but it's not sex in the grown-up way. Freud never posited sexual feelings, not adult sexual feelings in children. He posited a sexual instinct as part of our biological inheritance. And influenced as he was by Darwin, of course he would. If the principal function of DNA is to replicate itself, wouldn't you expect that to have a psychological component? Wouldn't you expect our psychology to evolve in such a way as to facilitate that drive? What Freud talked about were immature and childlike versions of this. Think about the way in which children explore their own bodies. Any of you been around 3-year-old boys lately? What do they do all the time? Where's their hand all the time? Maybe I should say. If you've been around 3-year-old boys, yeah, you know. It makes adults uncomfortable. They want to explore your body too. That makes you even more uncomfortable. right? This is a natural thing, but they know that touching themselves in particular ways feels good. They don't understand it in an adult way. They don't want to have sex with somebody in an adult way. They don't know what sex is, but they know that touching themselves in certain parts of their bodies in certain ways feels good. And that exploration is part of this instinct that Freud did seek to describe. Freud also maintained that the feelings we have as children are not trivial, either then or when we're adults. Think about it. When's the last time you saw a 3-year-old, we'll use 3-year-olds, have a tantrum? It's serious. I mean, hopefully you never feel like that again in your whole life. The intensity of that experience is profound. Or when they wake up from a nightmare. Freud argued that those kinds of profound experiences are formative, and that the memories we have of them as adults are also important. And in the end, Freud offered self-awareness, particularly awareness of the contents of our unconscious, as the path to freedom. That doesn't sit very well these days. People don't want it to be like that. You can all, in this era of Oprah-induced psychobabble and Dr. Phil's phony fixes, you can almost hear Freud. I won't fake the accent, but you can almost hear Freud saying, you'd like this to be easy. You want to swallow a pill, to confess on television and be cured before the last commercial, but you don't even know what your disease is. And that focus on the unconscious and the fact that so much of our minds and the things that influence us lie outside of our awareness is probably the core element of psychoanalytic theory. Of course, Freud was wrong in some of his ideas about human nature. His theory of drives, the sex and aggression drive, and his views on aggression were too mechanistic and simple. His theory of development focused too exclusively on sexuality and not enough on the interpersonal and social conditions that shape our minds. And his theory of female development was wrong. But to reject psychoanalytic theory, because to reject psychoanalytic thinking, but because Freud's instinct theory or his view of women is dated, is like rejecting modern physics because Newton did not understand relativity. The more remarkable point, in my view, is that many of Freud's fundamental propositions about the nature of the human mind have stood the test of time. Many of his assumptions about human nature have a considerably stronger empirical basis than most critics realize or admit. And let's be honest, this is probably the best anyone could hope for in a rapidly changing discipline like psychology 70 years after his death. There are in particular, and I'll leave you with this, 5 propositions developed originally by Freud that have found widespread empirical support and homes in modern experimental psychology, though often without acknowledgement of their origins. These include that much of mental life, including thoughts, feelings, and motives, is unconscious, which means that we sometimes behave in ways that are inexplicable even to ourselves. 2, mental processes, including emotions and motivations, operate in parallel, so that we can have conflicting feelings toward the same person or situation. Feelings that motivate us in opposing ways and lead us to strange or unpleasant interactions that occur over and over. Those of you who have had more than one long-term intimate relationship will realize that you find yourself having the same argument with different people. There's one constant in that equation. Number 3, stable personality patterns begin to form in childhood, and childhood experiences play an important role in personality development, particularly in shaping the ways we form later intimate relationships. 4, our mental representations of the self, others, and relationships guide our interactions with others and influence the ways we behave. How we think about people, the ideas that we have that have formed over the course of our lives influence how we think about the people in our lives now, how we treat them, the kinds of people we choose, the kinds of relationships we choose. There's, how many students are here, 5,000 or so? 3,000 students. Let's imagine that it's 50-50 male-female. It's not, but let's imagine that it were. Would you be equally likely to pick any of the preferred gender to go out with? Of course not. We all have these unconscious algorithms in our minds that lead us to prefer certain things over others. Even if someone's perfectly reasonable, then you may not be attracted to them, and you won't necessarily know why. 5, personality development involves not only learning to regulate sexual and aggressive feelings, but also moving from an immature dependent state to a mature independent one. Those 5 things are broadly accepted in many areas of psychology, and there's much support for those claims. The fact is, modern psychology has borrowed many ideas from Freud, often renamed them, and then failed to credit their discoverer. From the implicit thinking of modern cognitive theory to the notion of a modular mind current in neuroscience, ideas initially presented by Freud and his followers now find homes in developmental psychology, in social psychology, in cognitive psychology, and in the labs of the neuroscientist. Perhaps in the future, psychologists and neuroscientists will become less reticent about situating their ideas in their proper historical context, and finally, giving Freud his due. Thank you.
Thank you for that overview, Tim. And I'd like to turn it over now to Scott Allison, who will offer some ideas from the modern perspective of psychological sciences. Do you want to wander, Scott?
Can you hear me okay? I'm going to hold this rather phallic-looking object, and I'm going to sit here because I'm not worthy of the podium. See, I'm one of these experimental psychologists whose knowledge of Freud you can fit into a thimble, because that was my training, that was the bias. So I don't know nearly as much as Tim does. What I do know is that in graduate school during my training, there was a strongly held, unwritten rule: don't listen to Freudian theory, don't take it seriously, and whatever you do, don't incorporate it into your own ideas, because that's ancient, outdated, obsolete stuff that is giggle-worthy, let's face it. When I teach Freudian psychology in my classes, we start going over the psychosexual stages of development, and then students start giggling. And so when I think about some of the reasons why why there's anti-Freud sentiment, one of the reasons is the Electra complex, the Oedipus complex, castration, anxiety, penis envy, all these things that make students giggle. And then what they do is that when we get to the really good stuff that has some validity and has a foundation in objectively obtained evidence in support of it, when we get to the good stuff that's supported, they dismiss it, because isn't this the same guy who said that girls have penis envy and boys want to marry their mother? And so they kind of discount, they throw the baby out with the bathwater, kind of a situation with my teaching of Freud, that this emphasis on childhood sexuality is one reason why Freud isn't taken seriously. If he had that to say, then we can't take seriously anything else he has to say. Plus, not to mention that that anyone who fails to use rigorous experimental methodology, well, we can't pay attention to their data. And there is a strongly held bias in the academic community to only take seriously findings that were obtained through rigorous, controlled, scientific, systematic, experimental methodology. And Freud, of course, used other techniques. He was more creative, actually. He used hypnosis, dream interpretation, free association. He used a variety of psychoanalytic techniques that were very unscientific from the modern, so-called modern enlightened perspective. And I got to tell you, early in my career, the scientific method and scientific methodology was the only way to get at valid data, and the only way to make valid inferences about human behavior was in an experiment. And now I've since learned better, and now I almost on a 180. Now I really welcome, as a breath of fresh air, techniques like Freud's that dare go beyond the scientific experiment. And Tim mentioned a bunch of reasons why Freud is so important today, and he did a much better job than I can about articulating the importance of Freud. For one thing, he is to be admired for coming up with the first theory of human personality. Just 100 years ago, when you think about all of human history, Freud was the first to propose a theory of human personality, and that is amazing that he was able to do what he did, propose what he did from scratch, being the first. And And another reason why Freud is important, I think, is even if you disagree with Freud, and a lot of people did and still do, a lot of theories of personality use Freud as sort of a base of opposition to develop their own theories. So the humanistic psychologists who believe humans can be self-actualized and humans have the ability to reach beautiful, healthy, full potential, they use Freud's theory as a base of opposition. Because Freud, if you read Civilization as Discontents, this is kind of a bleak view of human nature, that we're destined to be unhappy, or that it's much easier to be unhappy than happy. And there's so many things operating against us to derail our attempt to be happy. Well, humanistic psychology argues that we can be happy, and it can happen. And this is how it can happen. Sort of a precursor to modern positive psychology that focuses on health and well-being and subjective well-being. And Tim mentioned a variety of ways that modern research in psychology is now discovering a lot of the things Freud said a century ago, like the role of the unconscious. Wow, I never thought when I started in social psychology almost 30 years ago that so much emphasis in my field would be on unconscious processes. Because 30 years ago, social psychologists would laugh at the idea that social behavior is determined unconsciously. And now there are volumes of research dedicated to the role of unconscious processes in social behavior. We look at nonverbal behavior. Which is a better indicator of how you're really feeling? What you're saying or what your body language is? And we know that body language is actually many times a better revealing of what you really think and feel, because you have less control over your posture and your facial expressions and your gesturing. And because you have less control over it, the real you is going to leak out non-verbally, and we know that. Freud's idea of defense mechanisms, brilliant. That we use defense mechanisms to protect ourselves from anxiety, whether it's regression or displacement or sublimation or reaction formation. We use defense mechanisms, and we're not aware of it, but they protect us. They shield us from anxiety. It's just a fact. Automatic processing, fascinating stuff in the last 10 years in social psychology. There have been studies done in the past few years showing that if I give you a bunch of sentences to read, and embedded among those sentences, there are sentences about the elderly, when you walk out of the experiment, you're going to be walking out more slowly, and you're going to have less good posture. You're going to resemble the elderly because the category of elderliness has been primed just from reading sentences about the elderly. No lie, that's the finding. And there's many different fascinating things that we have found that suggest that we are influenced by forces beyond our control, or beyond our awareness. There's a literature in social cognition on spontaneous trait inferences, that we automatically make judgments about people. We're not aware of it. We have no control over it. But if we see someone behave in a certain way, we make judgments whether we know it or not, and we have no control over it. There's research on implicit attitudes and stereotyping, that all of us have implicit attitudes, and even if we maintain that we are unprejudiced, there are tests like the implicit association test that show that we can't hide our prejudices. They leak out in ways that we're not aware of. And it's very humbling for us to recognize that, and to recognize there are theories by people like Freud that are 100 years old that predicted this very thing. And so Freud is being vindicated in a lot of ways. And yeah, we can giggle at Oedipus Complex and penis envy, but oh my gosh, the guy was incredible. The brilliant man who had amazing insights about human nature, human sexual desires, humans as animals, humans as self-destructive. How many of you know someone who is self-destructive? How many of us are self-destructive in one form or another, either through substance abuse or unhealthy habits? Freud was right on top of that. And that's probably all I have to say, really. What I'd love to do now is turn this over to Jane and get questions from you. We'd love to hear from you. Your thoughts, observations, either about the book, Freud, or anything Tim or I have had to say.
Before I do turn it over, I'd just like to add my 2 cents as a developmental psychologist. I study the lifespan with a particular emphasis on aging and memory. And so from my field, we know that 2 aspects of Freudian theory, at least, are on target, are supported by modern experimental research. One is the presence of infantile amnesia, what we do and don't remember from about the age of 3.5 and beyond. And then secondly, Freud, there, I've just made a slip here. Not Tim, but Scott, my daddy over there maybe, I don't know. Scott mentioned the defense mechanisms, and developmental work, social developmental work, shows that we become increasingly sophisticated in our use of defense mechanisms, moving from, as young children, the use of denial and repression and regression to more sophisticated, abstract, complex cognitive defense mechanisms, such as the use of humor, intellectualization, and sublimation. We sublimate our aggressive and love instincts, passion instincts, in socially appropriate ways. And finally, we internalize our parents, the so-called superego. Freud got a lot of the labels wrong, but Scott's absolutely right that he gave us the first personality theory, and of those, that tripartite structure, the id, the ego, and the superego is just that set of rules that our parents and society have taught us. We have internalized a moral code. The methods are different from psychoanalysis. We model a good behavior. Our parents shape good behavior. And so modern social learning theorists have given us that kind of information about Freudian ideas packaged differently. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to anyone who has the first question for our panelists. Yes. And I'm going to ask you to speak into the mic because this is being taped, not to make you anxious.
Well, you just mentioned something about how Freud had this idea sort of that we were doomed almost to unhappiness. And I get the feeling, just because I haven't read in depth Freud yet, I've just sort of started it. So maybe a quick answer, but people seem to have this misconception about Nietzsche too, that he was quite pessimistic and that he was just like, oh, we're all doomed to, miserable lives and we don't know what the heck we're talking about. But it seems to me a lot more like Nietzsche was really just saying, yeah, life is kind of a struggle, get over it and accept it so you can thrive on it. Is Freud really saying this, you're doomed to unhappiness, or these are the conditions around which you have to work to gain happiness?
Yes. Now, Freud his view of humans was quite pessimistic. He believed that, by and large, we're animals, and that we struggle against our animal natures all the time. If I can do it a terrible injustice and distill civilization and its discontents to 1 or 2 lines, it's that we're animals, social animals, with all of these urges that society forces us to contain at the threat of death. And that for most people, most of the time, people who don't have the luxury or don't have the willingness to get to know themselves really, most of life is spent in response to these urges, either in response to the urges or in responses to the attempt not to get punished for having and expressing the urges. Toward the end of his career, he became even more pessimistic. Of course, like I said, he had jaw cancer for 15 years before in the end he died, and he died as a result of a morphine overdose administered by his personal physician at his request. The treatment, I should tell you, this may give you some insight. The treatment was to have the necrotic tissue scraped away with a metal blade and the wound packed with sulfa drugs, and then a prosthesis placed every day. So 15 years of that, and your view of human life is probably not the rosiest. It's interesting, though, because he did always, till the end, offer the idea that self-knowledge gives you a way out. His famous dictum, right, where it has been, ego shall be. That as you come to know yourself and absorb those parts of yourself that have previously been unconscious into your sense of who you are, then and only then do you have a kind of freedom and the ability to make choices where before you merely acted or reacted from from these instinctual drives. There's a great quote. There's a guy named Ernest Becker that at some point in your life you should read. It's a very famous book actually from the 70s called The Denial of Death. Becker was an existentialist, and he reimagined Freudian theory from an existential perspective. And his turn of phrase, and it's coarse but it's accurate, is the reason that humans struggle the way that we do is because we're gods with anuses. That we have mental capacities that allow us to think in abstract ways about things that don't exist, most importantly the inevitability of our own death, but still animals that have to go poop. And that somewhere in that crucible is the psychology of the human. So that's a long answer to a short question. But.
Scott, do you have a reply to that?
I can't follow a poop garden.
Next. Jamie.
Dr. Allison, you mentioned that Freud is beginning to be vindicated, more recently. And I'm wondering, how much of Freud would you really be willing to teach in one of your classes? And would you be more willing to teach Freud if it was, say, rebranded as something else, as a more modern theory?
Oh, yeah, because I think that, like I said, 30 years ago, you would be vilified if you defended Freud or believed in Freud. And even now, even though Freud is being vindicated to a large degree by current data, it still would not behoove you to acknowledge Freud too openly in public, lest you be laughed at. It's gotten a lot better, I think, in social psychology. There are articles that will now say, yeah, hey, Freud may have been right about some things. There's a reluctant acknowledgement of his contributions more and more. So would I be willing to teach Freud in my classes? Yeah, but I might skip over the psychosexual stuff so they don't get the giggles, because the minutes you get the giggles, when people start, like Tim was just saying, well, I'm giggling about poop jokes. Well, Aldolf might protest too much, that sort of thing, that people may be giggling because there's something there. And I think a lot of psychoanalysts might look into that. But yeah, I'd be willing to do that, Jamie. Would you take me seriously if I taught Freud and said Freud was right on top of modern social psych research? Would you be okay with that? Or would you start a rumor to keep students away from my classes if I did that? You'd never do that? Okay.
But would you take the class?
Would you?
Other questions?
You'll have to excuse me for not being too well read with Freud, but it seems to me that a lot of the reluctance to accept his theories nowadays have to do with his methodologies. And I didn't hear any real defense of his methodologies even here. It seems like most of the defense of his work is when it's applied to the modern, experiment theory. We can test these things empirically now in the labs, and it sounds like Dr. Berry and Dr. Allison have both done this. But when we talk about things like hypnosis and free association and stuff, the methods of Freud, is there really any defense to this? Because all I've ever heard is criticism.
But surely you don't believe everything you hear, right? You find out for yourself, right? This is what I'm talking about. People have opinions about Freud without ever having learned much about him. And imagine someone, we also have the same argument now in public about Darwin. Right? People have questions about Darwin, or question Darwin's theory and methods in public from religious perspectives, without ever having read Darwin, usually. But to get to your question, as I said earlier, I think Freud's methodologies are probably best suited to generating hypotheses, not to testing them. Now, he said he did both, but of course, he's in a different tradition. The kind of really 19th century methodology that still dominates in psychology really doesn't dominate in other sciences in the same way. In fact, other sciences claim that psychology isn't a science. And what they say to us is, well, if you're a science, where are your laws? Because psychology has been using the empirical method about as long as the other disciplines. There's just mythology you get taught in intro. Psychology is a young science. No, it's not. Psychology has been using the scientific method maybe 50 years less than biology and chemistry. Maybe. Well, we've still had 150 years at it. They have lots of laws. We don't have any. Right, so there's a big argument about the finality of findings in the empirical method as well, but that's another discussion. about the philosophy of science. What I can say to you about Freud's methods are, I think principally they were best for generating ideas, not testing them. And that taking his word for, yeah, I tested this and it was true, is probably best done with a grain of salt. But, like Dr. Allison says, there are some examples of it that get tested from other perspectives. Things like free association, the implicit association test, that do in fact find lots of support for those methods. Now, hypnosis is a strange case because, for one, there's a whole literature and modern research on hypnosis, including all kinds of EEG studies and lots of empirical research on hypnosis. But Freud never really liked hypnosis and had abandoned it by 1895. He didn't like it because, for two reasons. One, that it produced only temporary results, like catharsis, which he also abandoned in the early 1900s, because the results were always only temporary. And the other thing that made him really uncomfortable, being a middle-class, bourgeois Austrian Jew, was that it changed what later he came to recognize as the transference, so that when you used hypnosis, it caused these patients to admire you and think how powerful and wonderful you were. And in one instance, he cites the young woman, after coming out of hypnosis, leapt up and hugged him, which he was mortified. So for that and a variety of other reasons, and some rumors that he wasn't a very good hypnotist, he gave that up pretty early. But your question about the methodology is more complicated than you might think. But here's the thing. And again, let me encourage you. This guy's a seminal thinker. Whatever you think of him, and whatever you think of him at the other end after studying him, but study and learn. Don't have an opinion about someone this important without knowing for yourself. I mean, you owe yourself that sort of intellectual experience. And then when people ask you questions, you can speak from knowledge. It's really too bad, back when I could still read German, and I didn't fall out of practice, reading Freud in German is an amazing experience. I mean, he was an incredible writer. In translation, it's highly variable. The early stuff that was translated by the Strachey's is very hard to read. It's very hard to read. They took some of the terms like id, ego, and superego. Freud never used those terms. He used German terms, es, ich, über ich. Very much simpler and closer to experience. He didn't use Latin like that. They thought they'd spice it up with some Latin. So, but even in translation, reading and understanding that probably 6 or 7 things you ought to read, and then have an opinion. And I think what you'll find is you're at least more sympathetic even if you're not convinced.
Other questions?
Come on, what do you really want to know?
In fact, the physical sciences have accused psychological science of having physics envy. It's true.
So what was the reason that Freud was using these, seemingly ridiculous metaphors if he didn't want to be ridiculed?
They're ridiculous to us now because we've heard them and thought about them in a very prescribed way. But, think about an 8-month-old baby, okay, crawling. And what do they do with everything they find?
Put it in their mouth.
Put it in their mouth. So what Freud was talking about with the anal stage, or the oral stage rather, was the mouth is the vehicle of exploration of the world. And that at the same time, the child is managing certain psychological issues around dependence. What happens when I depend on someone? And they don't think about it in that way, but they learn what happens when you're dependent upon another person. Because if your parents stop feeding you, you can't crawl down to the U-crops. You're done. Right? And so the experience of dependence and of nurturing and of how your parents respond to your needs becomes an important part. In fact, at that point in life, it's almost all of your experience. What happens when you cry? What happens when you need your diaper changed or you're hungry and you can't express that? That's what the oral stage is about, right? The anal stage, that's a metaphor, he centered it on potty training, for issues of control and creativity. There's a little known, it's not little known, it's widely known but little discussed fact. If you don't want to poop, no one can make you. And if you do, no one can stop you. But kids know that. Right? And if you've been around a child being potty trained, you'll realize that they know that. And this idea of control and control of the body, but also control of others, occurs at the same time that language is developing. And think about this as a psychological event. Language, for the first time, makes real the distance between you and other people. Because up to now, they could kind of be an extension of your own fantasies. But once you have to use language to communicate and realize there's a different word for you and mom, you get the beginning of this realization, right? So metaphorical in that sense, and in those senses, I don't think it's ridiculous. But when it gets presented to you the way that it does, as these discrete stages, and anal, and they use words like that, and genital, and you want to have sex with your mom, of course, it is ridiculous. But it's much more complicated than that, and he would never be famous if it were merely that.
Hi, Dr. Hulsey. You mentioned a little bit about how a lot of the terms used by Freud are actually kind of disguised or kind of renamed in other theories that are better accepted. Can you talk a little bit about that?
About how the terms get...
You mentioned how the Freudian terms are kind of laughed at a lot of the times and not as well accepted. But in other theories, same sort of concept, same sort of issue, just named differently. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Let me give just a brief answer, because Scott's better situated to answer this question than I am. Well, for example, there's this notion of implicit thinking that occurred in cognitive psychology, or the cognitive unconscious, Kihlstrom's cognitive unconscious in the late 70s and early 80s. The idea that, in fact, much of what we do without thinking about it. Automaticity is another term that people use. This will scare you, but if you really knew where modern cognitive neuroscience is, you would be very uncomfortable. Because in fact, what modern psychology maintains is that about 95% of what you do is controlled by processes outside your awareness. Blink, Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, was sort of a popular version of that idea. That you don't know what you do half the time, more than half, 95% of the time. Now, Freud's unconscious is dynamic. It's a seething cauldron of forces and sex and aggression and all this. The automatic unconscious or cognitive unconscious isn't described in the same ways, but the basic idea that much of our behavior is controlled by forces outside of our awareness is very simple. The modular mind, right? Freud had a mind that had parts in it, conscious and preconscious and unconscious, and that the mind was sort of divided into modules that were ways of thinking. Well, if you read Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, or Steven Pinker's book on consciousness, that's just what they're arguing for too. A modular mind, not dissimilar from that one. So, and there are a number of those, but Scott knows this stuff better than I do.
Well, go ahead, Scott. I was just going to say that the ego, take the ego, that's the self. And so modern psychologists study the self. They don't study the ego. The superego is your moral compass. It's your internalized voice telling you what's good and bad and right and wrong. So people who study moral behavior would use that term instead of the superego. The id, we've talked just about those unconscious impulses and instincts. Yeah, instincts. And by the way, speaking of one of the most popular Freudian metaphors, or metaphors attributed to Freud, the tip of the iceberg, he never used it. He never said it. I defy you to find a reference to Freud using that metaphor, and it will appear in every intro psych book you read on Freud.
And social psychologists discovered in 1977 this thing called the false consensus effect, the idea that we think other people share our attitudes and opinions. And really, Freud's talking about projecting, and projecting biases long before that. So we tend to come up with new labels for the old stuff and forget about the origins of the idea because they're Freudian origins, and we don't want to go there, perhaps. So, good examples, Jane.
And a more modern clinical term for anal retentive would be obsessive compulsive. And that's perfectly acceptable. And in the DSM-5 or whatever version clinical psychologists are on for DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Other questions? Yes? We're right at 8:30, and I know that some people need to leave, but others are welcome to stay. We can stay about another 15 minutes or half hour even. Yes, Ray?
I wonder, in your opinion, was Freud a pessimist or was he a realist?
Well, that's a nice distinction, actually. I mean, I could argue both ways. I think that's a great question. I think sometimes he was pessimistic and many times he was realistic. But this is going to reflect my own personal biases. It would have to answer your question. I think probably he was realistic. When I look around at the world, at what people actually do, not what they say about what they do, not what they say they'd like to do, but what they actually do, it's not so good, you know. I mean, and you look at the history of humanity. We're just not nice. We're not nice. That's not to say that individuals aren't nice or that nice things don't happen. But when you look at the arc of history, it's kind of littered with the bones of people with spear points in them. So it seems pessimistic, and probably is at times, maybe even overly so. But I think a lot of it's pretty realistic. I mean, you don't have to look very far in the world today to see that a lot of the ideas about aggression and sexuality get played out every day all over the world, and they're not usually that nice. That's a great question, though. I love the nuance, because people often say, was he a pessimist or an optimist? Well, clearly he wasn't an optimist, but a realist. That's a much more important distinction.
Shizia?
As we know that many of Freud's theories were derived based on his clinical experience, and I know many of his patients at that time were from the middle or upper class. So if his theories is kind of built based on those patients, do you think those theories is still applicable to current society?
We have almost an entire field of psychology based on the study of 18 and 19-year-old college freshmen and sophomores as participants. So I'm really not in a position to criticize Freud's narrow slice of a sample to study. But that has been a criticism of Freud, that he looked at mostly, and maybe Tim can rebut this or rebuke it, that he based his theory largely on his clinical observation of Victorian-era young women who were highly neurotic. But then so much of what we study is generalizable. So many studies of college freshmen and sophomores have been published, 90% of psychology studies published using intro psych students as participants have been replicated using a broader sample. Maybe Tim can speak to populations outside of Freud's sample.
Yeah, part of the problem, of course, is that Freud couldn't help that he was alive in the Victorian era, and couldn't help who came to see him. Right? It wasn't a choice. There wasn't really anybody else for him to see. But your observation is correct. There was a little more variability in it than that. He saw men, he saw people younger and older, and he saw quite a few, actually, over the course of his career. But in the end, your criticism is accurate. The validity of the claims, though, have to come later. I really think that has to be borne out. Freud's a discoverer, I think. Maybe that's the best way, to get back to your question, the best way to understand him, as the discoverer of ideas. Then now these ideas have been discovered, they have to be held up to the light of day and examined, and we see if they're valid for a broader swath of humanity. And some have been, and some haven't. But there's another piece to this. One is that there are multiple methods to assess the validity of a claim, not just the do it in a lab with 18-year-old college students. There are multiple methods, and those often get short shrift in psychology, the alternative to the empirical method. That's one big thing. The other is, we're really not that different from each other like we'd pretend. If an anthropologist came from Mars, I don't think he, she, or whatever would really see us as very different. We focus on the little sliver of difference, the tiny fraction of percents in which we differ, rather than seeing the ways that we're all the same. Physiologically we're the same. Our physiognomy is essentially the same. I look out across this room, the way we dress is essentially the same. We're really very similar. And so I think that even while there are cultural differences that are important and noticeable to us, I'm not sure how different we are from a more distant perspective.
Can I add one little supporting thing to that?
Please.
Which is that we're saying, well, Freud, the only patients he saw may have been bourgeois middle-class Viennese, but he was an incredibly erudite, well-read European man who had read the great European literature, especially famously Dostoevsky, where he found a lot of his theories kind of confirmed in these novels. And these novels are not about middle-class European bourgeois citizens. They're about these completely psychotic, hysterical, illiterate fanatic Russian peasants that murder their fathers. And, but I think he, I mean, famously found some of his theories kind of vindicated and also inspired by, how are we going to call it, fictional views of a part of human nature that he couldn't have encountered on his own.
Another psych major over here.
I was really curious when you were talking about Freud being in Vienna, and how influenced was he by the Vienna Circle of Philosophers and what was going on in the the educational society there during the late 1800s? How influenced was he by them, and how did he influence that society?
There are people in the room, I'm sure, who are better qualified to answer this than I, but I'll do what I can. It's very interesting because Freud clearly read Nietzsche, for example. It's less clear how many of the other philosophers he read. He read a lot of archaeology. That was his thing. It's really interesting. If you go to his house in London, they have his library. It's a cool thing to read Freud, but it's a much cooler thing to have been read by Freud. And what you find in his library is that most of it is archaeology, and he was really taken with this. He collected antiquities, mostly little statues, but other kinds of things. Etruscan and Egyptian, those were his big ones. But not a lot of philosophy. It was really, he read all of Poe and all of Mark Twain. There's a lot of people who have challenged and said, well, his ideas clearly came from this philosopher or that. And when pressed, he would sometimes admit as much. Clearly, Nietzsche influenced his thinking. He's roughly contemporary to Heidegger. There's this sort of these ideas in the air in this part of Europe at the time. Not Heidegger, who am I thinking of? Help me, huh? No, before that. Anyway,
Schopenhauer?
I'll think of it.
I think he read Schopenhauer.
There's this culture of ideas in the air around this time. It's got to be that they cross-pollinated each other. It has to be, because by the time by 1915 or so, Freud's already famous. I mean, he's published a number of things by then. His dream book is, though at first it sort of receives no notice, it starts to catch on. He's written three essays on the theory of sexuality. I mean, a lot of these his basic ideas have already been published. He's created a circle around him. It's become an international circle. So he has to have been. He was never clear about it and never discussed it. And even his biographers don't offer much insight into that. There's a great biography. Maybe the best thing I could recommend to you if you really want to know something about Freud is go get Peter Gay's biography. You'll see it and you'll go, oh, it's that big, and you'll say, Peter Gay's a great writer. He's a historian, not a psychologist, and his writing is very accessible and it's very conversational in tone and easy to read. I mean, maybe you read it a little bit at a time over the course of some weeks or months, but it's a great overview of Freud's life and theories.
I have two questions, but maybe they're related. It's like Freud has his theory like based on what people actually do. So we may think he's a realistic, like actually a materialism or something. But when he talk about like ego, he talk about like our ego is first of all, the whole world is our ego, and then the real world, the outer world came out of this ego. So it's kind of like the real thing is coming out from our mind, from our feeling, not just from the real things. And another thing is like Freud think of our meaning of life. When, like in his mind, meaning of life is mainly about happiness, and happiness is actually a feeling, not something material, but a feeling. And actually, he says. Like people tend to pursue those happiness, and at least avoid the pain. So for himself, he killed himself using some like to avoid the pain of the illness. So that's actually a good example of his opinion of like meaning of life, because he want to avoid the pain. But if that's so, should people like use more and more drugs? Because drugs definitely give you happiness or feeling of happiness. But if you talk people about this question, people have definitely not to take so much drug because they have something more important in their life. So can we talk about this?
That's a wide-ranging variety of ideas. Let me begin with the idea of happiness. Freud said that the closest we get to happiness is to love someone and be loved by them in return, and to find work that's gratifying. And if you do those two things, you've won. That was his definition of happiness. Now, the pleasure the pleasure principle that you're describing, he didn't use the word in the way that it was used later by behaviorists. So when Freud talks about the pleasure principle, he's not talking about seeking pleasure and avoiding pain in the way that you might think of with the behaviorists. His ideas about it are much simpler. As a child, when all the world is id, because the ego emerges from the id, the pleasure principle is most active. And you can be, as a child, you can be satisfied through fantasy up to a point in a way that you can't later. That thinking about a thing and the experience of the thing aren't yet separate. And so the thinking of the thing evokes the experience of the thing in infancy. That's the Freudian theory. He suffered with lots of pain for a long time before he died. And produced some of his most memorable works during that time. So I'm not sure that we can say that in the end the drugs were to take away the pain. He in fact took as little of the morphine as he could because he hated its effects. He said it clouded his mind, and he couldn't think or write, and he couldn't work with patients. So he was always taking as little as he could, and toward the end it became problematic. In fact, he probably would have died a few years earlier, but he needed to sort of retain his wits to get his family out of Vienna when the Nazis came in. In fact, he didn't want to even leave after the Nazis came in. But then the second time that his daughter Anna was detained and they kept her overnight, he realized it was time to go. But of course he's 80 years old by then, 82 years old. But he saw his family to London. It took major interventions by the French government and the American government. The president personally intervened to get him and his family out of Vienna. He goes to London, he gets the house set up, and he lives about another year. And then says, that's all, I'm done. I'm 84 years old. I've had jaw cancer for 15 years. I've done everything I wanted to do. I'm done. And dies. Now, I don't know what conclusions you can draw, if any, about his views on drugs from that. I think that probably what he would say is that people use drugs to escape reality. And that just in the same way that we do all kinds of things to escape reality. We use defense mechanisms. We bury ourselves in the love of another or the love of an idea or the love of a career, all in an attempt not to know ourselves. Because the scary thing about psychoanalysis as a therapy is that it asks you not only to know things about yourself that you don't know, but it asks you to know things about yourself that you don't want to know, right? Things that you desperately want not to be true, right? It asks you to open the basement door and go see what's down there. And most people don't want to do that.
Scott, did you want to add anything at this point? Well, just that I think Tim has said it, but the reality principle grows out of the pleasure principle, and that the delay of gratification characterizes the ego's task. So whereas the id will say, I want it now, and the 3-year-old boy who can run around yanking on his penis can't do that when the ego emerges and the reality principle kicks in. He needs to delay. The 20-year-old needs to delay that gratification or that exploration of the erogenous zone, because the ego, and even more importantly, the superego, the external world, is internalized, saying you can't do that now, delay that. So that relationship between the pleasure principle and reality principle is critical in the emergence of, in the developing self.
In a symbolic form.
Right.
And make do.
Right. Other questions? Yes.
This is addressed to either speaker. From what it seems to me, I'd just like either one of you to comment on this. From what it seems to me, from thus far I've read in the amount that I've read in Freud, it seems to me like his ideas are mostly compatible with sort of an intensive agricultural society as opposed to more primitive, more simple, sort of hunter-gatherer societies, where pleasure and happiness almost doesn't exist in the same form. You don't get surplus, you don't have the opportunity to create art and such, if you follow Maslow's pyramid. How do you think Freudian views would work in such simpler societies where you don't have the same sort of this intangible term, happiness or pleasure is not the same thing?
Well, I'm going to have to challenge your premise, because hunter-gatherers do in fact make art and always have, right? I mean, even as far back, you've got the cave paintings. They made art, right? And they had, as far as we can tell, and from modern primitive tribes we do have good evidence, highly evolved cultures. And I think the issue of deprivation depended a lot on seasons and location. I mean, if you look at the places where primitive cultures have survived, typically in the tropics, they've got an abundance. They got so much abundance that they don't have to work but about 3 or 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time they spend doing the kinds of social things that tie groups together. So I'm not sure it's accurate to say that their experience of happiness is fundamentally different from ours or from cultures who live in other ways. The things that make them happy might be different, but the underlying experience of it, I'm not so sure that that's true. I think probably if we could time travel or pick ourselves up and go to another time and spend enough time there, really in any point in history, to learn the language and integrate ourselves into the society, I think we'd find out that they were pretty much the same as we are. Shorter, but otherwise pretty much the same. That's my sense. And the older I get, the more sure of that I become, actually. So back to your question about happiness, I think probably, and Freud's claim clearly was that the basic pressures on us and the things that thwart our happiness or facilitate it or thwart aggression or the expression of other sorts of instincts, the specifics may change, but the underlying urges don't. So, I mean, it's hard to say for sure, but I mean, that's his claim.
I think one of the most popular psychological frameworks that a lot of laymen come in contact with is the Myers-Briggs personality profile. And I've known about it since I was little, and there's even an app on Facebook that a lot of my friends have, just to get your little 4-letter designation. INFP. But it's my understanding that the Myers-Briggs was developed from Carl Jung's work, and I know at least for a little while Carl Jung and Freud were very close, and I know that changed. But where does obviously the Myers-Briggs is a modern test, and so where does it stand between psychoanalysis and modern psychology?
Yeah, the Myers-Briggs, and I don't know if you have any familiar or want to talk about this, but no. The Myers-Briggs is not based in psychoanalytic theory. It's based kind of loosely on some of Carl Jung's later work. Jung and Freud had a famously ugly falling out for a lot of reasons. And neither was blameless, but I have to say Jung was more to blame. I mean, it's a great history if you ever want to read it. Jung was treating a woman named Sabine Spielrein, who later became a really important social worker and theorist, with whom he was also having an affair. And Freud, to his shame, helped Jung out of it and covered it up. And shortly after that, Jung became incredibly bitter toward Freud and began really escalating in this kind of hostility, and would write these letters that were increasingly hateful, and Freud would say, "My dear Carl, what's going on here? I don't understand your anger." And Carl would say, "You don't understand because you don't want to." And it was a very kind of father-son thing, very strange. But I digress. Myers-Briggs has no bearing on psychoanalytic theory per se. In fact, there aren't any. Freud was never involved with any sorts of tests other than the kind of, say the first thing that comes to your mind test. But tests that developed out of psychoanalytic theory were things like the sentence completion. I start a sentence and you finish it. The Rorschach, the inkblot test. Those are based on psychoanalytic ideas. Okay. The word association test, right? I say a word, you say the first thing that comes to mind. Those, but they weren't developed by Freud, but only in response to his theories.
The MBTI actually has some research to back up its dimensions. It's a modern personality theory, but it is way overshadowed by the Big Five or five-factor model of personality. In fact, the creators of the Big Five personality model have gone to great lengths to take every other personality test that's ever been published by anyone and show that all of them are derivatives of their five-factor model, Costa and McRae. But it's an example, the MBTI being affiliated with or coming from Jungian psychology as being dismissed by serious practitioners of personality psychology today. And it's used more in applied settings, personnel, and so on. Other questions or comments as we wrap it up? One more from us. Well, let's have one from one of our core instructors, and we have another student up there. Let's hear from a student, and then we'll let Tom speak.
After having read Civilizations and Discondense, I was just wondering what you would think about, what Freud would think about the atrocities of civilization, like the apartheid or like the Holocaust, and the factions within societies.
Yeah, I think he'd say, but of course. I mean, really, I think I'm not being flip. I think Freud, that's really kind of what he saw for most humans most of the time. He saw our tribalism. He saw our base animal nature. He saw our instincts, and he saw very few checks on those, civilization being one of them. But of course, there's a price, right? Civilization exacts a price. In return for suppressing your instincts so that you can live in a group, what happens? You get neurotic, right? That's the trade. And it's a necessary trade, according to Freud, to be able to live together in big groups. But even within that, always lurking just under the surface are these drives and urges and wants. And given the opportunity, they burst out. And sometimes even without the opportunity, they burst out, criminals and such. So I think he would be shaking his head sadly and saying, I told you so, but I wished I was wrong. Be my guess.
Tim, could you say a few words about the value of Freud's studies in hysteria?
What do you want to know? I mean, it's a huge question, so I'm curious what you're...
Well, if you can contrast what he was doing with hysteria with modern popular notions of hysteria. Also, the fact that he was criticized for being the first person, or one of the first people to find hysteria in men.
Well, hysteria, it's an old notion, and it doesn't, and part of my confusion is that hysteria doesn't get used now like it got used then. Hysteria was a generic catch-all term. Hysteria was later what became to be called neurosis. It was a generic term for a kind of fairly mild psychopathology that a lot of people had. You want a great read, go read, actually that's not fair to say. You want to understand something fundamental about Freud, go read The Psychopathology of Everyday Life. Because what Freud wasn't saying that he wasn't demonizing neurosis. He was saying quite the opposite. He was saying we're all neurotic. And we do neurotic things all the time. And neurotic is normal. But early in his career in particular, hysteria was the term that was more widely used. And of course it has pejorative and sexist connotations all the way back from the original Greek. It's the sort of a bastardized version of the term for wandering uterus. And it was based on some old theories about women's reproductive organs causing them to be crazy. And so the term came to them that way. Freud was claiming that these same symptoms exist in men. Well, they can exist in men. Men don't have uteruses. Well, yeah. But of course, the same kinds of symptoms do exist in men. And it became a much broader sort of notion that came to be called neurosis. Now, there is a disorder now called histrionic personality disorder, which is characterized by some of the kind of hypersexualized symptoms you would see in the classic hysteric. But of course, the thing about histrionic personality disorders, they're very flamboyant and like to be the center of attention and like to draw attention to themselves by virtue of their sexuality, but they don't actually like to have sex. So you can imagine what a quandary this is for the men who are drawn to them. But that's a very narrowly defined personality disorder, not the broader term that was used in the 19th century. It's one of the things about teaching the history of psychology, which is the undergraduate class that I teach most often. is that you get very humble. Because what you begin to realize is that there was never a point in history when, if you could go back in your time machine and ask, why do people do that? They would have said, well, no idea. They always had an idea. Humans, it's our nature to have causal explanations. They always had theories. And the theories were often very sophisticated. And there's this great sort of pendulum where in times of plenty, we have physical descriptions for psychological problems. In times of lack, we fall back on psychological and spiritual explanations of psychological problems. And it goes back and forth. And every generation thinks they've found the answer. And we're no different than that. Just that we're sure, because we have machines and body fluids. Right? But I mean, it's a really interesting thing to see. A lot of Freud's ideas can come right from Aristotle. I mean, it's not really that different, who also talked about hysteria.
We're coming to the end of our time. If there's one more burning question, we'll entertain it.
I was wondering if, just for a minute, you talk about Freud and religion.
He hated it. Freud said that Freud refused to grant religion any special place in the human condition, refused to grant it any sort of special status, said it was just another symptom of neurosis. As far as he could tell, there was no God. Nobody had ever found any proof for one, and that people who believed in one did so for neurotic reasons. Namely, we would all really, really like it if a very kindly and loving grandfather that was all-powerful and all-knowing lived somewhere in the sky and looked after us. But it just ain't so. That's what Freud would have said. Probably without the ain't.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Tim Halsey and Scott Allison, for a fascinating evening.